I would probably just want to go into why this topic of Lot and the call of Abraham. And the more I thought about it, I think it's important that we remind ourselves. There is this passage in um, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 at verse 11, which tells us that the things that now, all these things had happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. And the point of it is that when we read things within the Bible, when we read stories, they're not meant to be just stories, for, merely to teach a moral or to teach our children, but we have to see ourselves in the pages, in those stories, and think of how they apply to our lives. In the story of Lot in particular, I find it a very interesting one, and I hope that um, by the end of our talk tonight, you probably would agree, because it's a story that it's supposed to give us hope. It's supposed to remind us of God's work in not only their lives in the past, not only of his mercies in their times in times past, but we're supposed to see how these things apply to us today. Now, there was a story that I read of recently, and I went online and I looked it up to see, well, is this one of just those feel good stories that someone kind of just concocted and um, they use it, but it's really not true. But I looked it up and it actually was true. It was about an experiment that was done. Maybe you've heard of it in the past. It was about putting a set of rats in a pool and having them swimming. And just at a point of exhaustion, after about 15 minutes, they took them out, dried them, and then because they were just about to pass out, and then they put them right back in after a short while. And surprisingly, they didn't swim for another 15 minutes. They swam for 60 hours, which is a ridiculously long time compared to being exhausted after 15 minutes. And it was a story that was used to show. Now, this is a story back in the 50s, and we'll not worry about the ethics or anything about this experiment, except it was allowed in the 50s. And the point of the story was that when there's hope, when we see how things are the deliverance that was given after that 15 minutes, these animals were able to go on for a ridiculously long, much longer time than before, because there was hope, because they felt at any point they could be delivered again. And no doubt, if we see that applied to our lives, we realize that God has given us hope as well. He's shown us examples such as Brother Abraham or Brother Lot and seen his deliverance there. And he's told us to look at these and to be encouraged in our lives, because these things were written to encourage us. So when we read of the patriarchs, we have to receive encouragement. We often would look at the story of Abraham and just think of, well, this was just a man that was living there, and God just seemingly plucked him out of nowhere and chose to work with him after somehow Abraham started to listen to God's call. However, the more I looked at this in preparation for this talk that was first given last year, I realized that there was much more to this family tree, and it should not be taken in isolation from the other families during that time. Now, what do I mean by this? I think we ought to see that God's hand was interacting with his people throughout the ages, and it didn't just start suddenly with Abraham. And when we look at it this way, we might see a broader picture about Abraham and his family through these wider lenses. Now, let's consider Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, where it says, and to Set, to him was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord, or as the NLT puts it, at that time, people first began to worship the Lord by name. So those worshiping here before were introduced to Abraham as the sons of God. And we read of this phrase, the sons of God, in Genesis chapter 6 at verse 2. We read of it in other places such as Job 1 at verse 6, which tells us that those children of God, those who served him, they were called the sons of God. They were called by the name of God. It was in effect the early form of the ecclesia. And Romans 8 verse 14 tells us, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. So unfortunately, these believers began over time to mingle with those humans that did not follow God. And they're referred to as the daughters of men, such as those descended from Cain. It was here that the ecclesia mingled with those whose beliefs were not aligned with God's, and wickedness became rampant. A departure from true worship towards an apostate religion ensued. And this word apostasy, as we look at this evening, it comes up over and over. It's an act of refusing to continue to follow, obey, or recognize a religious faith. Now, terror was not called in Acts chapter, as we learn in Acts chapter 7, verse 4. It says Terah went to Haran, and after Haran died, near to Babylon, we learn that Abraham was the one who was called. Terah, incidentally, means to tarry or to delay. And we wonder, did Abraham himself actually live during a time where he would have interacted with others within the wider family of God, where he would have gained faith by maybe meeting someone such as Noah? Did their times overlap? We can look at this and we can consider it when we look at the timelines of their lives, which we'll look at shortly. Now, I'd like us to consider the timelines in terms of Noah. We know that God chose Noah out of the people of his time. I'll just flip over to this timeline, and it shows the timeline from Adam to the flood. And we see that even as time went on, remember they were living for quite a long time. So someone like Noah would have been a young man not long after someone like Seth. Seth would have died quite likely shortly before Noah's birth. The timelines of everyone was going on for a much longer time than we would probably imagine. We know that God called Noah out of the people in his time, and I'll just flip over to what he said of Noah. God said of Noah that the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. This was a time where, This was a time where the earth was becoming increasingly wicked, and the people, the sons of God, had turned away from him, such that Noah, and we're not even told that his family were righteous, but we're told that Noah was a just man. He was perfect in his generations, and he walked with God. I'm reading from Genesis chapter 6 at verse 9. And then in verse 13, it says, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them from the earth. However, when we in the timelines that we were looking at earlier, we see that someone like Noah would have still, even by his the time when he was born, there was still somewhat of that influence around of some of the older ones like Seth, even though his death would not have been that long before him. He would have still had some of that, a godly ancestor and the influence around him by the time of his birth, but it sadly would have been on the decline. The sons of God and their influence would have been dwindling, some by death, others by crossing over to godlessness. The influence of elders like Seth would have grown less and less. And sadly, we see by Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, we're told that God said to Noah, "Come into the ark, thou and all thine house," because the end was upon them. There would have been an empty feeling as day after day, less and less of the sons of God would have appeared before him. I'm using words drawn from Job, evidently, where those who were meeting together, those who would have been worshiping God, those who would have known him, would have decreased. And so God said, the time has come for destruction. He said, "Come in, thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation." The NLT adds, "thee alone." He was the only one, we're told, that was righteous. So there would have been this empty feeling where day after day, fewer and fewer people would have had anything to do with God. You can liken it, or we can liken it, to just arriving one Sunday and for the memorial meeting, and only Noah and his family were there. We're not told of the righteousness of his sons or their wives, but God saved them. He sanctified them for Noah's sake, Noah being the righteous one. And this is a time that we could probably relate to in our times, where we see so many loved ones depart from following after the ways of God. This is a precursor to our thoughts surrounding Lot, because in the period following the flood, there was growth amongst those who would be called by the name of God, because it was a fresh start, and those that rejected him. Now, sadly, we see the reemergence and the continued growth of sin, as we're told that humans set about making for themselves another God. They wanted to build a Tower of Babel, and God confounded their language, as we're told in Genesis chapter 11 at verse 4. Says, "And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." It was following this remarkable event at Babel that we come to Abraham, or Abram as he was then called. We are introduced to the family of Abraham, but we often fail to realize that he would have been born around the time of the death of Noah, as we see on this timeline. Remember that we are told that Noah was a just man and he was perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So I don't find it too far-fetched that Abraham may have been influenced as part of that family of God or he was one that was drawn out of that dying ember, the dying embers of truth that would have been around the time of Noah, as one who was the leaders, one of the patriarchs at that time within the ecclesia. Many others may have succumbed, have drifted away from the truth, but and we would have seen in Abraham's household even, that many around him would have fallen away. But God rescued Abraham. He would have rescued him just at a time when it seems like all hope was lost. This would have been somewhat interesting. It is interesting, I find, because there are 10 generations between Abraham and Noah, where there was such great corruption that we're told that every imagination of their heart was only wicked. And then from Noah to Abraham was also 10 generations, which may suggest that God was bringing a form of deliverance from the corruption of sin through Abraham. We ask ourselves, why 10 generations? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 2 to 3 tells us this. It says, it gives us an example where it says, we are told of no Moabite or Ammonite being allowed into the assembly, even up to the 10th generation. For those who might be familiar with that, Deuteronomy 23, verse 2 to 3. So why 10 generations? Is 10 generations something that is indicative of the length of time after which certain sins are pardoned and a new beginning can commence? We see elements that suggest some form of worship of the true God existed outside of Abraham's family. And I would like for us to look at some of these elements in God's word that suggest that as much as God was working with Abraham, there were embers of the truth or of knowledge of him that existed outside of Abraham's family at the time. Let's look at 3 pieces of evidence that we can probably think about that supports this fact. The first I'd like us to look at is in Genesis chapter 14 at verse 18. Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18, there's this rather peculiar case. After Abraham returned from the slaughter of these kings that he went out, he and his servants, it says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Now we ask ourselves, where did Melchizedek come from? And who was he a priest to? He couldn't just be a priest all by himself with no one that he's ministering to. Now my research points to him being a king priest in Salem, and it is disputed if this is eventually Jerusalem. Some have disputed it, some have different viewpoints. But we read a reference to Melchizedek in Psalms 110, which is all about Jesus, the coming king priest who will reign from Jerusalem and who will meet the faithful ones coming with bread and wine when they have conquered sin. Now, some Jewish literature even suggests that Melchizedek is another name for Shem, who would have been a little less than 500 years old and a leader of Noah's family, and hence he was a priestly role as an elder. But we don't see this in the Bible itself, so we can't take that as a fact, but it's something to think about. Now, how would this be possible, since we read in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3, of Melchizedek having not father, mother, beginning of days, end of life, etc. How was he therefore a priest? I think an argument can be made that this reference in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3 is in relation to Melchizedek not having lineage in relation to an established priesthood. And as such, no one made him a priest because of, let's say, his father being a priest or his mother or even the death of another priest. He was not after any established lineage of priesthood, and therefore the scriptures tell us that he's without father or mother. It doesn't mean he literally didn't have a father or mother, but in relation to his priesthood, he did not become a priest because of his lineage. It is simply by God's command just as Christ himself became a priest independently of any other priesthood. So I digress, but the point is that they were people of God at this time that were independently working to serve God outside of Abraham's family. So we have to realize that the truth, as we know, the truth at that time was beyond Abraham's family. Let's look at another piece of evidence that I'd like us to consider, and that is thinking of Abraham's family as possibly being derived from an apostate branch of true worship. We think of the fact that when Abraham was sending his servant to find a wife for Isaac, this is in Genesis 24, he sent him to another branch of his family to marry Rebekah, who was his brother's granddaughter. Now, in Genesis chapter 24, at verse 3 to 4, it says, "And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac." Now, we would understand that Abraham would not have wanted into marriage with the Canaanites because God had promised to remove them and give Abraham their land. However, Abraham specified to the servant that the wife for his son should be from his family. And similarly, we know when Jacob was running away from Esau, Isaac also instructed him to get a wife from this very self-same household. We ask ourselves, why? Why, if Abraham and Isaac were so concerned about apostasy and that into marriage among the Canaanites, why would they each seek to get a wife for their child, they specified not from among the Canaanites, but they went to their relatives? Were these relatives part of an apostate ecclesia maybe? Was there the knowledge of God somewhere in their lineage before? Well, if we look at Genesis chapter 24 at verse 31, when Laban meets the servant of Abraham, he says, "Come in, thou blessed of the Lord," L-O-R-D, capital L-O-R-D. "Wherefore standest thou without? For I have prepared the house and room for the camels." Now, isn't it puzzling that Laban would use the name Yahweh in his first greeting to the servant? It cannot be argued that Abraham had somehow revealed the true God to them by being a near contact. He was far away. In fact, Abraham was the servant was even telling them that Abraham had a son in his old age. It does suggest there wasn't that close contact. But yet this other family, these relatives of Abraham, knew of the Lord and used his name very commonly, it seems, by inviting them in, "Come in, thou blessed of the Lord." So Laban and family were definitely familiar with the Lord, and they spoke of him with familiarity. In Genesis chapter 24, at verse 50 to 51, it says, "Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, The thing proceeded from the Lord. We cannot speak unto thee good or bad, or thee bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before thee, take her and go, and let her be thy master's son, as the Lord had spoken." And similarly, when Laban pursued after Jacob escaped from serving him, in Genesis chapter 31 and verse 29, Laban said, it is in the power of my hand to do you hurt, but the God of your father spoke unto me yesternight, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. This is yet another verse where we see that the knowledge of God, in fact, I'd even say the fear of God, was in Laban's household. Where did it come from? If they were not somehow familiar with God from beforehand. Laban didn't say, Well, who art thou, Lord? He knew the Lord. He knew God, and he responded immediately to God's commands, despite there being false gods among them or graven images, despite the trickery that plagued his household. There was also that element of a knowledge of God. I'd like us to go over to a third bit of evidence that seems to suggest there was further knowledge of God within this household, outside of the family of Abraham. And that point has to do with Genesis chapter 12 at verse 1. And I'll read that for you. It says, Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land that I will shew thee. Have we ever wondered why did God specifically ask Abram to do all three of these things? He was very specific. These weren't wasted words. He said, out of the country of Ur, get thee out of thy father, from thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house. Maybe the country of Ur was a place where they worshiped false gods. We know that, and we'll look at that a bit later. He said, get away from his kindred, which the word has to do with your distant relatives. And then it says from your father's house, which are your closest family. Because why? Why should he leave them all? Why didn't God say, well, I'm going to work with you, Abraham, and bring them all along, and let's save them all and come with you to this great land that I'm going to take you to? I would suggest that God asked him to leave them behind, lest that ember of faith that God was working with in Abraham be extinguished, lest the faith of Abraham and his household be corrupted, and even Abraham and his family not be saved. I would suggest that this is the case because it leads us to wonder about Abraham's relatives. There's no mention of trying to convert anyone to this seemingly newfound faith, if it was newfound. I don't think it was. Or even taking him along with them. In fact, when God wanted him to leave and he took along his father with him, God even appeared to him a second time after the death of his father and said, leave here also and move on. God wanted him, Abraham, to separate from his kindred. He wanted to work with this man who, as far as having godly relatives and a godly family was concerned, he was as good as dead. Not only from a physical standpoint, but as possibly the last remaining one that would obey God and respond to his promptings. He was nearly as good as dead. This phrase, as good as dead, it comes from Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 12. And for those who might be looking it up, it says, therefore is found there even of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore, innumerable. Now, when we read this passage, we often would think, at least if you were like me, oh, Abraham was as good as dead. It means he was nearly 100 years old. He didn't have any children, and his seed was about to be wiped out, and he couldn't have children, and therefore he was as good as dead. But as I looked at this, I thought maybe there's another reason why the scriptures call Abraham as good as dead. And it has nothing to do with him and children, because if we remember, there was no question that Abraham could have children. As soon as Sarah said, go ahead, have Hagar, she didn't say it with any doubt. She knew Abraham could have children. And so Abraham had a child. He had Ishmael. And then God blessed him with Isaac, the promised seed. And after Sarah's death, Abraham went on to marry Keturah and have many more children. So there was never a question of whether Abraham was as good as dead from a physical standpoint. But could he have been good as dead from a spiritual standpoint? As someone who was hanging on by a thread spiritually, given where his family was, that if it were not for the mercy of God calling him out of Ur at the time when he did, and Abraham responding, that his family would have been consumed in apostasy, and he himself would have been dead. Dead not in a physical way just yet, but spiritually, he would have been taken away with sin. This is something we can think about when we look at this verse. Let's now, moving on from here, look at a bit closer at Abraham's ancestors, who they were. Well, I'm showing on our slide a few of Abraham's ancestors going back before him. We would be familiar with them, and we have their names. We are not told a lot about many of them, but when we look at the meanings of their names, it does give a bit of an insight as to where some of their minds were, or their parents' minds were when they received those names. Someone like Shem, we know why he would have gotten such a name. There was a reason for that. In terms of it, the meaning of it. Someone like Peleg, maybe division. We are told the earth was divided during that time. But as we come down the line towards Abraham, we looked at Terah, meaning to tarry or delay. We look at Nahor, meaning snorer, snorter, enraged, and Haran, meaning mountaineer. Milcah, meaning queen, Sarah, princess, Lot, covering. It seems, yes, there are elements of some positive thought, but compared to the other names that we come about later, it does not seem to have the same godly intent, the same focus as Abraham tried to inculcate after him. We might consider Joshua chapter 24 verse 2, where Joshua, when recounting Israel's history by reminding them that Terah, Abraham, and Nahor served other gods in Ur. This is in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2 to 3. It says, "And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood, and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed, and gave him Isaac." So this further supports the fact that Abraham was not coming from a family where the faith was strong, the truth was strong there, they would have been false worship around, and God was taking him out of it. Even the name Terah makes me wonder if the call to leave Ur and all it offered may have even been revealed to him, but he had delayed or failed to act on it in the manner that his son Abraham did in faith. But we can only speculate. Terah choosing to leave Ur would have been difficult. It would have required faith. When we think of Ur of the Chaldees, it was an ancient city that flourished until about 300 BC. It had a lot going for it. They had their false gods, yes, the moon god Nana, and the moon was worshipped in that city as the power that controlled the heavens and the life cycle on earth. To the Chaldeans, the phases of the moon represented the natural cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death. And they also used it to set the measurement of their yearly calendar. So for them, worshiping the gods of the moon and stars and so on would have been pretty common. They offered prayers and offerings to the moon to invoke its blessings. And so with Joshua chapter 24, verse 2 in mind, likely someone like Terah and his family would have been influenced living in that city where we're told that they worshipped other gods. Jude tells us the following. It says in Jude chapter 1, verse 20 to 23, it says, "But you, beloved, building yourselves up in your most holy faith, praying in the Holy Spirit, keep yourselves in the love of God, looking forward to the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ, the eternal life, and have mercy on some who are doubting. Save others, snatching them out of the fire, and on some have mercy with fear, hating even the garment polluted by the flesh." Now, this verse applies in more than one way, because not only did God use Abraham to save Lot from the false worship in Ur, and once more when Lot and his family were taken captive along with the people of Sodom, but he also saved Lot when entreating the angels who were on their way to destroy Sodom. I would like us, however, to see another way in which Abraham was used by God to pull Lot from the destruction that was around him. Not only the physical saving, the physical ways we just mentioned, saving his life, but there was a spiritual fire that Lot may well likely have been consumed in if he had remained in Ur of the Chaldees. Yes, we've mentioned a bit about Ur, their false worship. It was a place where they had the literal name of it means flames. It was a thriving city. It had about 0.1 of the world's population, which at the time, which in today's terms would have put it at a city of about 8 million, about the size of New York City. So Ur fell to the Elamites around 1940 BC. And so Abraham, being removed by God beforehand, was an incredible opportunity for him not to be caught up in the city's misfortunes, where quite often the rich would lose their lives and their possessions when the city is taken. Ur no longer exists today, and its demise is thought to be due to drought and a changing climate. Now we compare this fact of Ur being on the decline and how it eventually was destroyed by what God actually called Abraham out to. He called him from a place that was going to be destroyed, and he actually called him to a land that he said that God would bless, that would flow with milk and honey, a place that would actually Abraham would thrive in, a place where he would be safe. God would keep him safe. So, being able to widen the lens of time, we can and should be encouraged by what God accomplished in the life of Abraham. But it required him to turn away from what he could see and to turn to something that he couldn't see. We can similarly be called to help others around us who need deliverance. We're told in 1 Timothy 4, says, "Till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. Neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. Meditate upon these things. Give thyself wholly to them, that thy profiting may appear to all. Take heed unto thyself and unto the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee." So not only do we, like Abraham, have the opportunity of learning the truth and being saved ourselves by it, but by meditating upon it, sharing it with those around us, we can help to save those around us, just as Abraham helped to pull Lot along with him, and they were both saved ultimately. We started out in this talk when we were looking at we started out looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 at verse 11, and the fact of how these things that were written then, they apply to us today. And I'd like us to see with the city of Ur that so many of these things that we read of and we see in the lives of Abraham and Lot, they apply to us today. Passages such as Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 14, which tell us that we have no continuing city. We might think of how this applies to us today. Do we feel the need to get involved in fighting for what we want to save today? We might get involved in the politics of the day and in trying to salvage whatever remains of the Ur of our time. Or do we see that this God has called us for a new city to be a part of something much greater? Not that we're not concerned about what is going on, but we realize that the solution is not going to be on man's terms. It has to be on God's terms. That is one thing that definitely leaps out from the story of the way in which God called Abraham out, and Ur could not save him. Ur was going to be destroyed. But by Abraham leaving in faith and taking Lot with him, they actually went for something that was greater. There's another point we can look at when we think of apostasy, because, as I mentioned earlier, it has to do with not turning back, or apostasy is an act of refusing to continue in the path in which we started out, refusing to follow, obey, or recognize a religious faith. In Jeremiah chapter 8, we read of the people refusing to turn back to God. They're set on going a different path and they would not turn back. And similarly, we're told in 1 Timothy chapter 4 about the last days in which we live, that there would be that similar apostasy, a departure from the faith. There would be that seducing spirit, doctrines of devils, speaking lies, and having their consciences seared with a hot iron. That sounds like some of the challenges we would face today, where we find it difficult to lay hold on the life that God has called us to, and the pull of the world seems so appealing to us. It is our Ur. We have to see it as the call that is trying to pull us back towards it and not continue in the truth to which we've been called. So I'd like us to think, therefore, and the point of Bible study is not to learn facts, but to think of how this applies to us today. How does leaving apply to us today? There are many passages that we're reminded of because these were written for our learning and our admonition. There is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1 to 4, which says, "Now I request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed, either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come, that no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God." Now, no one would expect today that someone will actually deceive us by saying they're actually God. But taking God's place in our life is something that we each can struggle with, where be it our hobbies, be it our thoughts taking us towards what we can save ourselves, or other ways in which we can actually set him an idol, where we refuse to submit to God and place something above him. We can also find ourselves being sucked back into life in error rather than recognizing the blessing that is being extended to us to actually leave it behind. We can think of the filthy garments that was cast off when we made our vow to Christ at our baptism. Do we want to turn back and pick it up and try to compromise with it so that, like Abraham's extended family, we know the Lord, but we also know our false gods that we take along with us, that we still keep our hope in? There is another way in which that can apply to us, because unlike times where, in times past, our brethren were in fear of their lives, they had to lay firm hold on it, and they felt that there was no other choice but through God. Today, there are many competing causes, many options that are beckoning to us, that we say, well, you can be a Christian, but you can also, take part in, be it the politics of the world, or you can become as great as you want in whatever field of endeavor, and just kind of put God off to the side a bit. And it's a challenge that we have to fight against. We have to recognize that God has called us to leave that filthy garment behind, because like Ur was destroyed, he is coming to destroy that as well. It will be taken away. So, in conclusion, we've seen how Abraham responded to God's call, and God brought him out of Ur as a branch that would be planted in Canaan, and he would grow to be a new family. He would grow to be the people of God. So we looked at the eventual destruction of Ur. It was something that was destroyed. Even the name Ur means flames. And the many indicators we looked at along the way that indicated that true worship would have been there before among Abraham's extended family, but they would have slowly been pulled away by that allure of the world around them. And yet there were some elements that remained along the line in people like Laban's household. So I'd like us to consider Abraham's mission in saving Lot from a godless city that was set for destruction. It was something that we're told he did. He gave his all, and he more over and over pulled Lot along with him. And in doing so, he was able to establish Lot and pull him away from a life of destruction. Yes, there were things along the way that Lot did not respond as well as he would have hoped, but we know that ultimately there are passages that tells us of Lot's descendants, the Moabites and the Ammonites, being part of those that God actually watch out for in the end. There is a role for them also, and but it requires us, brothers and sisters, today, while we still have time, to look for those who may be like Lot around us, that requires help, that requires nurturing, that sometimes require us to, despite their best efforts to go the other way, to actually try and pull them along so that they're not consumed in the fire that is coming upon this earth. It requires a commitment from us as believers. It requires work and effort, and it requires prayer, that we ask God for those around us who may be struggling, not to cut them off, as would have been, Abraham could have just said, Lot, I've tried, and, maybe you went towards Sodom, maybe you, whatever area you fell into, I'll just move on with my family. But he didn't. And so, in doing so, he really made a difference in Lot's life. He wasn't negligent. He wasn't, careless about his relative. So we need to also think about this. There may be young people in our ecclesias, in our CYCs, and we make a difference in their lives. I'll end on this note, and I'll turn it back over to you, Brother Butch.